The glass in my hand didn't shake, even though every person in that room was staring at me like I had just confessed to something unforgivable. My mother's voice cut through the rehearsal dinner noise like a knife she'd been waiting years to use. "She abandoned her child," she said again, louder this time, as if repetition would turn it into truth. "She left her baby like it meant nothing." Some people gasped. Someone actually laughed like it was scandalous entertainment. Across the table, my fiancé Daniel didn't look at me. Not immediately. That was the part that hurt in a way I couldn't explain to anyone in that room. His fork just stopped halfway to his mouth. "And my father," he nodded. Like he agreed. Like they hadn't just set my entire life on fire in front of 70 guests and a floral centerpiece I had picked out myself. I remember thinking something strangely calm in that moment. So this is what they chose to do with my name. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. Because I already knew something was wrong. Not with me, with what they were trying to make everyone believe. And then my mother added, almost gently, "We didn't want this coming out tonight, but Daniel deserves to know who he's marrying." That was when the room shifted. Not toward me, away from me, like I had become something contagious. The strangest part wasn't the accusation. It was the timing. Why would my mother choose my rehearsal dinner to say something like that? Why did my father look relieved instead of shocked? And why did Daniel already look like he had heard this before? That last thought sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't swallow. Something had been said before tonight, something I wasn't part of. And if that was true, then who had been speaking for me? Before I continue, I honestly want to know something. Where are you watching this from? Because I keep thinking about how differently this story would feel depending on who hears it first. Family, strangers, people who have been through something similar. And if you end up staying with me through this, you'll understand why I didn't react the way everyone expected me to. Let's get back into it. My name is Alina Carter. I'm 31. I work in corporate compliance for a logistics firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic. My life, until that night, had been mostly predictable in the way people assume stability is boring until it disappears. Daniel and I had been together for 3 years. Engaged for 6 months. He was the kind of man people described as reliable, which I always thought was an underrated compliment. He wasn't flashy. He didn't play emotional games. He showed up on time, remembered details, and didn't disappear when things got complicated. Or at least that's what I believed. My parents, Richard and Helen Carter, had always been complicated in a quiet way. Not openly cruel. Not obviously controlling. Just the kind of parents who always seemed to remember events slightly differently than I did. I used to think that was normal, memory drift, family bias, that kind of thing. My mother especially had a way of correcting my version of events with a smile that made me question myself instead of her. "Sweetheart, you always exaggerate," she would say lightly, whenever I pointed out inconsistencies. And I would laugh it off. Because what else do you do when your own parents are the ones rewriting your reality? Daniel had met them a year into our relationship. Dinner at their house. My mother had cooked. My father had talked about his retirement plans. It had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly. Looking back, I remember how my mother watched Daniel more than she watched me that night. Not in approval, in measurement. Like she was deciding where he would eventually land. The first real crack didn't happen at the rehearsal dinner. It happened 3 weeks earlier. My mother called me at 8:14 p.m. on a Thursday. I remember the exact time because I was halfway through folding laundry when my phone lit up. "Alina," she said immediately, no greeting. "We need to talk about something important before the wedding." Her tone wasn't worried. It was controlled. I sat down on the edge of the couch. "What's wrong?" A pause. That pause was her signature. Then, "Has Daniel ever asked you about your past fully?" I frowned. "What does that mean?" Another pause, longer this time. "I just want to make sure," she said carefully, "that nothing unexpected comes out later." I remember laughing once, short and confused. "Mom, what are you talking about?" But she didn't laugh back. That was the first time I felt it, something underneath her words that didn't belong to concern. It belonged to preparation. At the rehearsal dinner, everything escalated too fast to track properly. My maid of honor, Jenna, leaned toward me first. "Alina, what is she talking about?" she whispered. I shook my head slowly. "I don't know." But I did know something else. Daniel still hadn't looked at me. My father stood up slightly, tapping his glass. "We didn't want this to come out like this," he said, voice heavy, almost rehearsed. "But there are things Alina hasn't been honest about." That word, honest, hit harder than the accusation itself. My mother stepped forward now, placing her hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder like she belonged there. "She had a child," she said clearly, "years ago, and she abandoned it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was structured. People turned toward me in stages, first confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to judgment. I felt my throat tighten, but not from emotion, from recognition. Because that was not just a lie, it was a specific lie. One I had never heard before tonight, and yet somehow my parents were telling it like it had history. Daniel finally looked at me, not angry, not confused, wounded. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. And that was when I realized something worse than the accusation. He wasn't asking because he didn't know. He was asking because he thought I might confirm it. I stared at him, at my mother, at my father, at the people rearranging my life in real time. And I said the only thing I could say without falling into their version of reality. "No!" My mother exhaled sharply, like I had disappointed her. "That's not what we were told," she said. And then from the entrance of the restaurant, a small voice spoke. "Is my mom here?" The room turned. Every head, every breath, every assumption shifted toward the door. And standing there, holding a small paper bag like she had been sent for something simple, was a little girl I had never seen in my life. But my mother went pale instantly, like she had just seen a ghost that knew her name. For a second, nobody moved. Not my mother, not my father, not Daniel, and definitely not me. The little girl stood in the entrance like she had walked into the wrong story but didn't yet understand how wrong it was. She held the paper bag tighter when she noticed everyone staring. I was told to come here," she said again, softer this time. Her eyes scanned the room, then landed on me. Something in her expression shifted immediately, like recognition without certainty. Like she had been trained to look for someone she wasn't fully sure existed. My mother's voice came out sharper than before. "Who sent you?" she snapped. The girl flinched, and that flinch did something to the room that my mother didn't expect. It made people uncomfortable with her tone. Daniel finally spoke, low and confused. "Why is there a child here?" No one answered him. Because my mother was staring at the girl like she had just walked out of a locked box. The girl lifted the bag slightly. "My mom said I should give this to Alina Carter." My full name landed like a dropped plate. My father shifted in his seat, the first visible crack in his composure. My mother forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous. This is clearly some kind of misunderstanding." But her voice wasn't stable anymore. It had started to fracture. I stood up slowly, not because I knew what I was doing, but because staying seated suddenly felt like agreeing to something I hadn't consented to. "I don't know her," I said quietly. The girl frowned immediately. "But you're Alina." That small certainty in her voice hit harder than the accusation before it. Because children don't perform lies the same way adults do. Daniel turned toward me again. "Alina, do you—" "No," I said again, sharper this time. "I don't know her." My mother cut in immediately. "This is clearly some kind of setup. I don't know who would bring a child here." The girl interrupted her without meaning to, just honest confusion. "My mom said you know what this is," she said, holding out the bag again. "She said you left it behind." That word, left, my stomach tightened, because I had never heard this story before, but my parents had. That realization didn't land as emotion. It landed as structure, like I had just found a missing page in a script everyone else had already read. My father stood now. "Enough," he said firmly. "This is inappropriate. We are not discussing private family matters in front of—" "Private," I repeated before I could stop myself. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut him off anyway. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. My father looked at me like I had broken a rule. My mother stepped forward again, trying to regain control of the room like she always did when things slipped. "Alina, sit down. We will handle this later." That sentence. "We will handle this." Like I was still a child in their house. Like I hadn't built a life they were actively rewriting in front of strangers. Daniel finally stood too, and when he spoke, His voice wasn't soft anymore. It was confused in a way that was turning into something heavier. "Alina, why would your parents say something like that if it wasn't true?" That was the moment I felt it. Not anger, not sadness, isolation. Because the person I was supposed to build a life with was now standing closer to their version of me than mine. I turned toward him slowly. "Do you hear what you're saying?" I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation answered more than words ever could. The little girl stepped forward again, breaking the tension unintentionally. "I was told to give this to you," she said again, more urgent now. My mother moved too quickly. "Stop this," she said sharply, reaching out as if to block her. But the girl pulled back instinctively. And in that small movement, the paper bag slipped, fell, hit the floor. Something inside shifted, rolled slightly. A small, old-looking photo slid halfway out. And in that instant, my mother's entire expression changed. Not anger, not confusion. Fear. I bent down slowly before anyone could stop me. My fingers touched the edge of the photo. And when I pulled it fully into view, the room changed again. Because it was me, younger, standing in a hospital hallway, holding something wrapped in a blanket. My breath stopped. I didn't remember this photo being taken. My mother moved fast now, too fast. "Don't touch that," she said sharply. But it was already too late. Daniel had seen it. So had the guests leaning in. So had the truth beginning to rearrange itself in real time. I stared at the photo, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel accused. I felt disoriented, because I didn't remember that moment. Not like that. Not like this version they were presenting. My internal thought was simple, almost distant. Why don't I remember this? Another thought followed immediately, or do I remember it differently? My mother reached for the photo again, but I didn't give it back. That was the first time I noticed my hand wasn't shaking. Guests began whispering, not loudly. That was worse. Whispering meant they were forming conclusions they didn't want to say out loud. Daniel looked at the photo again, then at me, then at the child, then back at my parents. His voice lowered. "What is this?" My father answered too quickly. "A misunderstanding from years ago." Too fast, too clean. The girl spoke again quietly, almost apologetic. "My mom said she had to leave because no one would help her." My mother snapped instantly. "That is not true." But the speed of her denial was now working against her, because denial only works when it feels natural. And nothing about her tone did anymore. Denial, silence. My father tried to intervene. "Alina, stop, this is not the time." "No," I said, cutting him off. "Answer me." A pause too long to be accidental. My mother adjusted her posture slightly. The smallest tell, a shift from control to calculation. "We were trying to protect you," she said finally. That sentence made something in my chest go cold, because it didn't answer anything. It explained everything away instead. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Protect her from what?" My mother didn't look at him when she answered. "From the truth." And in that moment, I understood something important. They weren't improvising. They were continuing something. The girl reached into the bag again. This time she pulled out an envelope. Old, folded. Her hands shook slightly as she held it up. "My mom said if anyone argued, I should show this." She looked at me, then my parents, then Daniel, and opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, and on the top line was my mother's signature. The room went completely still, and my mother whispered something I almost didn't hear. "No," but it wasn't denial. It was recognition. The paper didn't even look dramatic at first. Just an old envelope, slightly bent at the corners like it had been hidden and reopened more than once. But the moment the little girl unfolded it and turned it toward the room, the energy shifted again, this time in a way that wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition. My mother saw it first. Her face drained so quickly it almost looked unreal, like someone had pulled the color out of her. "No," she said again, but quieter this time. "Put that away." The girl hesitated. "My mom said I had to show it." My father leaned forward sharply. "Give it here." But Daniel moved first. That was the part I didn't expect. He stepped between them, not toward me, not toward my parents, but toward the letter. Like his instincts were finally choosing evidence over loyalty. "Let her read it," he said. My mother's eyes snapped to him. "Daniel, this is private." "No," he cut in, voice sharper now. Nothing about tonight is private anymore. That line landed heavier than anything else, because it meant the boundary had already been broken, and nobody was pretending otherwise anymore. The girl's small voice broke the tension again. My mom wrote that you promised to help her. Silence. A new kind, not shocked silence, calculated silence. My mother finally spoke, carefully now, like she was choosing each word from a locked box. This is not what it looks like. I almost laughed, because that sentence is never used when things are simple. People were no longer watching me the same way. I could feel it. The narrative had started bending. First, I was the accused. Now I was the unknown variable. My father tried to regain control again, standing fully this time. This is a private matter between families, he said firmly. It has nothing to do with this wedding. But someone from the guests, someone I didn't even know, spoke up. Then why does it involve her signature? That question changed everything. My mother turned toward the table immediately. Excuse me. The guest didn't back down. You said she abandoned a child, but this letter looks like she was involved in something. That hesitation, something, was enough to widen the fracture. Daniel finally looked at me again, but this time it wasn't accusation. It was uncertainty turning into alarm. Elena, he said slowly, why would your mother have a letter with your name on it from years ago? That question hit differently, because it wasn't emotional anymore. It was logical, and logic is harder to fight in a room full of witnesses. I looked at the letter again, and something in me tried to connect it to a memory, but it didn't attach cleanly. That was the unsettling part. It wasn't missing. It was displaced, like trying to recall a dream someone else already edited. My internal thoughts surfaced, uninvited. Why does this feel familiar and foreign at the same time? Another followed. Why does my mother look like she knows exactly what's inside it? My stomach tightened, but not from fear, from contradiction. Because if I truly had done what they were claiming, why didn't I remember the version they were describing? A guest whispered too loudly now. I thought she said she had no idea what they were talking about. Another voice followed. Something doesn't add up. My mother heard it. Her composure slipped for the first time into visible irritation. You are all misunderstanding this, she said sharply. This is a private family matter being twisted. But the problem was no longer the accusation. It was the inconsistency. Daniel took the letter from the girl carefully now. And that alone, him touching it instead of me, felt like a quiet emotional shift I couldn't ignore. He read the first line, then paused, then read it again. His face changed slowly, like the words were reprogramming something in real time. Elena, he said quietly. My name didn't sound like blame anymore. It sounded like confusion trying to stabilize. What? I asked. He didn't answer immediately, that hesitation again. Then he turned the letter slightly so I could see the top. And I saw it, my mother's signature, not a forgery, not a copy, real ink, old ink, and beneath it, a statement about arrangements, support, and responsibility. Words that didn't align with anything I had ever been told about my life. My father finally snapped. Stop reading that, he said, voice rising. This is manipulation. But no one reacted to his tone anymore, because his authority wasn't working. Not here, not now. The girl pointed at the bottom of the letter. My mom said this name is important. My mother reacted instantly. Don't! But Daniel had already looked, and I saw his expression shift again. Slowly, like something had just clicked into place that shouldn't have been there. He said the name out loud, and I felt the room tilt slightly. Not because it was dramatic, because it was specific. A name tied to a past I had never been allowed to question. My mother spoke too quickly again. That name is irrelevant. That was the mistake, because irrelevant things don't get defended that fast. Daniel lowered the letter slightly. Why is your signature on this? He asked my mother directly. And for the first time all night, she didn't answer immediately. I started noticing something new. The inconsistencies weren't random. They were structured. My parents weren't reacting like people caught in a misunderstanding. They were reacting like people managing exposure. And suddenly, a memory fragment surfaced. Not clear, not complete, just a hallway, a chair, a conversation I couldn't fully hear, and my mother's voice saying, "We will handle it so it never comes back to you." My breath slowed. Not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough to know this wasn't about tonight. This had been going on longer than tonight. Daniel finally looked at my parents, not as in-laws, not as authority figures, just as people presenting conflicting truths. "Did you tell me she had a child?" he asked. My mother answered too quickly. "We told you what we knew," my father added immediately. "We were protecting everyone involved." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." Silence again, but this silence was different, because now it felt like avoidance, not confusion. He turned back to me slowly. "Alina, did you ever have a child?" That question landed differently than before, because now it wasn't accusation. It was fracture testing reality. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said the only thing that was fully stable in my mind. "No." But this time, even I could hear the uncertainty underneath it. And that was when I realized the most dangerous part of all of this. It wasn't just what they were saying. It was what they had already made other people believe. The girl reached back into the bag again. Everyone froze instantly, even my mother, even my father, even Daniel. Because something about her movements now felt intentional. Like she hadn't brought one thing, she had brought layers. She pulled out a second envelope. This one was newer, cleaner. Addressed in handwriting I recognized instantly because it was mine. I hadn't seen it in years. My mother whispered, almost inaudible, "Where did she get that?" And Daniel looked at me, not at the letter, not at the child, at me, waiting. And for the first time since this started, I didn't have an immediate answer. The second envelope changed the entire temperature of the room, not because it was dramatic, because it was personal. It was mine, my handwriting, my name. My way of folding the corner just slightly uneven like I always did when I was in a hurry. Daniel stared at it like it was a live wire. "Alina," he said again, slower now, "this is yours." I didn't reach for it immediately. That hesitation wasn't emotional. It was recognition trying to organize itself. My mother moved first, too fast again. "That doesn't belong here," she said sharply, reaching toward the girl. But Daniel stopped her this time. His hand didn't touch her, just blocked her path. "No," he said, "not anymore." That "not anymore" landed heavier than anything else he had said tonight, because it meant something had already crossed a line of return. The girl looked up at me. "My mom said I should only give you this if they lied," she said quietly. My stomach tightened. That word, if implied there was a version of truth I hadn't been given access to. The room didn't move. Nobody even shifted in their chairs. It felt like everyone was waiting for the same thing, whether I would confirm my own past. I finally took the envelope. My fingers didn't shake. That was the strange part. Inside was a single folded sheet. No theatrics, no embellishment, just paper that had been handled carefully like it mattered. I unfolded it slowly, and I saw my own handwriting again. But the words didn't align cleanly with anything I remembered. I read the first line silently. Then again, my internal thought surfaced immediately. I don't remember writing this. Another thought followed, sharper, but I recognized the tone. That contradiction hit harder than any accusation, because it meant one of two things. Either I had written something I had fully blocked, or someone had built something around my name and my handwriting. My mother's voice cut through it. "You don't need to read that." That wasn't a suggestion. It was a reflex. Daniel turned to her slowly. "Why not?" he asked. And that was the moment I saw it, the shift from defensive to cornered. A guest stood up halfway from their chair. "I think we need to slow down here," she said awkwardly. "This is getting confusing." Another voice immediately responded. "It's not confusing, it's inconsistent." That word, inconsistent, spread faster than anything else, because people trust patterns more than emotions. My father tried again. "This is not a courtroom," he said firmly. "You are all reacting to partial information." But someone at the table answered him directly. "Then why does it feel like you've been preparing for this story already?" That question landed clean. Too clean, my mother exhaled sharply, and I saw it not anger anymore. Pressure. Daniel opened the letter in my hands carefully, like he was afraid of tearing something that might matter later. He read it silently. His face changed in stages again. Confusion, then recognition, then something closer to disbelief. "Alina," he said slowly, This is dated 5 years ago. My stomach tightened slightly. 5 years ago, before Daniel. Before the engagement. Before the version of my life I currently lived. My mother spoke immediately. That doesn't mean anything. But her voice wasn't steady anymore, because now the timeline was becoming visible. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because truth can be attacked. But meaning control is something else entirely. I looked at my mother, really looked, and something in my mind shifted slightly, not emotion, structure. My internal thought formed clearly: they aren't reacting, they are managing exposure. Daniel looked up from the letter again. "This says you requested assistance," he said slowly. "From your parents." My mother interrupted quickly. "That's not how it should be interpreted." But Daniel wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me, waiting for alignment. And I realized something unsettling. If I didn't confirm or deny quickly enough, I would become whatever story filled the silence. A whisper moved through the room again. "She's not denying it clearly anymore. Maybe there is something. I don't understand why the parents would fabricate something like this." Each sentence didn't accuse me directly, but it didn't need to. My father noticed it too. His voice sharpened. "This is exactly what we were trying to avoid," he said. "Misinterpretation in front of an audience." That word, audience, made a few people uncomfortable, because it reframed the room, not as witnesses, but participants. Daniel finally turned toward my father. "Did you show me this story before tonight?" he asked. Silence, long enough to answer. My mother stepped in quickly. "We told you concerns, yes, any parent would," but Daniel cut her off. "Concerns are not this." He held up the letter again. "This is documentation." And that was the first time I saw my mother lose synchronization. Her expression flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Daniel pointed to the bottom of the letter again. "There's a part missing," he said. My mother stiffened instantly. My father looked down too late. The girl spoke softly. "My mom said that part is why they're lying." That sentence didn't make sense immediately, but it didn't need to, because it implied omission, not fabrication. Omission always feels heavier in rooms like this. Daniel looked at me again. "Alina, do you know what she's talking about?" I didn't answer immediately, because something was happening internally. A pressure, a faint recognition, not memory, something closer to emotional residue. And then a fragment surfaced. Not full clarity, just a conversation. My mother's voice again. "That section doesn't need to be included when we discuss it later." I blinked slowly. My breathing stayed steady, but something in me had shifted. Daniel stepped back slightly, not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable. That distance mattered, because it wasn't physical, it was interpretive. "Alina," he said quietly, "I need you to help me understand this." That was the moment everything narrowed. Not accusation, not defense, expectation. I looked at the letter, then at my parents, then at the girl. And I realized something uncomfortable. Every version of this story required me to accept a version of myself I didn't fully recognize. My mother spoke again, softer now. "Don't let this confuse you," she said. "We're protecting you from something you don't need to reopen." That sentence almost worked, almost, until Daniel asked one more question. "From what?" Silence. And in that silence, the girl spoke again. "My mom said you already tried to hide it once." My mother reacted instantly. "No," she said sharply, but it was too late, because Daniel had already read further down the letter. And I saw it in his face before he said it. Recognition that didn't belong in the present. He looked at me slowly. "Alina," he said, then paused, then said a name I hadn't heard in years, not from my parents, not from anyone in my current life. A name that didn't belong in this room. And when he said it, my mother closed her eyes for the first time all night, like she had been waiting for that exact moment to fail. The moment Daniel said it, the air in the restaurant didn't just change. It stalled. Like someone had hit pause on everyone except the people who already knew what was coming. My mother opened her eyes slowly, not shocked, resigned. That was worse. My father whispered, "Daniel, don't." But it sounded late, like a warning delivered after impact. Daniel looked at me, but not in the way he had earlier tonight. Not confusion, not doubt. Now it was recalibration. like he was trying to place me in a version of reality that had just split open. "I've seen this name before," he said quietly. That sentence didn't land like an accusation. It landed like exposure, because it implied history existed without me. My mother finally spoke, voice tight. "This is exactly what we didn't want tonight," she said. Old information being misunderstood. But now people were no longer listening to tone. They were listening to structure, and the structure was collapsing. A guest at the far table spoke without raising their hand. "So, was she actually involved in something or not?" My mother turned instantly. "Excuse me," but the damage was already spreading. Another voice followed. "Because it looks like they've been controlling what she knows." That word, controlling, made my father visibly stiffen. Daniel didn't defend them. That silence mattered more than any statement. I stood still, not reacting, not yet, because something inside me had shifted into observation mode, not emotional survival, pattern recognition. My internal thought formed clearly. They didn't just lie, they built a narrative and rehearsed it. Daniel flipped the letter again, then stopped. "There's a page missing," he said. My mother's expression tightened immediately. "No, there isn't." But Daniel looked up. "Yes, there is." That contradiction hit differently because it was measurable, not emotional, physical absence. The girl stepped closer, almost whispering now. "My mom said that page is why they had to make a second story." That phrase, second story, made the room lean in. Because now it wasn't just about me, it was about construction. Daniel looked at me again. "Alina, did you ever see that missing page?" I didn't answer immediately, because something was happening in my memory again, not clarity, pressure, like something behind a door I wasn't supposed to open. And then a flicker, my mother standing in a kitchen, folding something quickly, saying, "We don't need to complicate what already ended." I blinked, slowly. "No," I said finally. "I never saw it." But even as I said it, I heard the uncertainty in my own voice. A woman at the table stood up. "This is actually disturbing," she said. "If this is real, she's been isolated from information about herself." My father snapped immediately. "That is not what happened." But now he was reacting instead of controlling. That difference was obvious to everyone. Daniel turned toward him. "Then explain it cleanly," he said. "Right now." Silence. My mother stepped forward again, trying to stabilize the narrative. "There was a situation years ago," she said carefully. "We handled it privately because it involved sensitive family matters." But now even her wording betrayed her. Handled it, not resolved, not clarified. Handled. Daniel looked at her. "That's not an explanation," he said flatly. And for the first time, she didn't have a follow-up sentence ready. I noticed something then, not just what they were saying, but how they were saying it. Every answer avoided direct memory confirmation. Every explanation avoided personal ownership. Every correction redirected responsibility outward. It wasn't defense. It was containment. My internal thought sharpened. They didn't just lie to me. They managed my access to truth. That realization didn't feel emotional. It felt structural. Like I had just stepped outside a system I had been inside my whole life without seeing its shape. Daniel lowered the letter slightly. "Alina," he said again, but softer now. "Did they ever tell you the full story of your past?" And that question was the first one I couldn't answer immediately with certainty. Not because I didn't know, but because I didn't know what I didn't know. My mother tried again, voice sharper now. "This is inappropriate in front of guests." But someone responded immediately. "Then why did you bring it here?" That question hit like a reversal. Because it removed blame from me and placed it on them. My father stood again. "This is being manipulated by outside information," he said, but the room didn't follow him anymore. The narrative had already shifted. Daniel looked at him. "No," he said, "it's being revealed by outside information." That distinction ended the argument, because one implies distortion, the other implies exposure. The girl stepped forward again, clutching the envelope tighter. "My mom said if you deny it, I should give you this part too." My mother's face tightened instantly. "No," she said again, but this time it wasn't controlled. It was urgent. Daniel held out his hand. "Give it!" And she did. Inside the second piece of paper wasn't a letter. It was a record, dates. Names, payments, arrangements, not emotional language, administrative language. The kind of language people use when they want distance between themselves and consequences. Daniel read it slowly, then stopped, then looked at my mother. This says you agreed to, he paused, reading again, manage a situation involving Alina. My mother's voice broke slightly for the first time. That's not how it should be interpreted. But Daniel didn't look at her anymore. He looked at me and said something that changed the room completely. They were involved in controlling what you were told about your own life. Silence. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. The kind that rearranges every earlier memory. Something in me went quiet, not numb, focused. I looked at my parents, not as emotional figures, but as participants in a system I was only now seeing the outline of. My voice came out calm. Who is the girl's mother? That question shifted everything again, because it wasn't defensive. It was investigative. My mother hesitated for half a second too long, and that half second told the truth more clearly than any answer. Daniel noticed it too. You know her, he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was confirmation. My father finally spoke, but slower now. This doesn't need to continue here. But it was too late, because it already had. The girl looked at me again, then said quietly, My mom said you didn't abandon me. Silence. My mother went rigid. Daniel turned slowly toward me, and I felt it the moment everything was about to connect, not emotionally, structurally, because now there were no isolated lies left, only a network. And Daniel said the next name again, the one from the letter. The one my mother tried to bury. And this time, it wasn't just recognition. It was confirmation of a truth I had never been allowed to assemble. The name Daniel repeated didn't just sit in the air. It reorganized it. I watched people at the tables shift in real time, leaning back, leaning forward, exchanging looks that weren't confusion anymore. They were pattern matching. My mother noticed it too. Her posture changed slightly. Not dramatic. Controlled people don't collapse dramatically, they tighten. This is going too far, she said, forcing calm into her voice. You're all reacting to fragments of information that are being misused. But nobody nodded anymore. That was the difference now. Even agreement had stopped being automatic. Daniel didn't respond to her. He looked at the documents again instead, then spoke quietly. This isn't a misunderstanding. My father's voice sharpened instantly. Daniel, but Daniel cut him off. It's a structure. That word landed heavier than anything else so far, because it removed emotion from the equation entirely, and replaced it with intent. My mother tried again, but her words were starting to lose precision. You're not seeing the full context, she said quickly. There are personal reasons, complicated ones. Complicated, someone at the table repeated under their breath. And that repetition was enough to fracture her momentum, because now her language wasn't convincing anyone. It was just being quoted. Daniel turned slightly toward her. How long have you been shaping what she believes about her own past? He asked. The question wasn't loud, but it was surgical. My mother froze for a fraction of a second, and that fraction said more than anything she had defended all night. My father stepped in immediately. This is not your place to interrogate us. Daniel didn't move. That's exactly the problem, he said. It was my place to be misled, though. Silence again. But this silence had weight now. It wasn't uncertainty. It was judgment forming. Something in me shifted again, not emotionally, structurally. I looked at my mother and father not as parents reacting badly, but as people who had been actively positioned in my memory. My internal thought formed slowly. If they shaped this story, what else did they shape? Another followed immediately. How many of my memories are complete? That thought didn't feel like panic. It felt like recalibration, like standing in a room where the furniture had been moved while I was blindfolded. Daniel glanced at me briefly. Not accusation anymore, alignment testing. And I realized something unsettling. He was no longer deciding whether I was guilty. He was deciding whether I had been used. The girl stepped forward again. Her voice was smaller now, but steadier. My mom said there was a time you tried to come back, she said to me. My mother reacted instantly. That's enough, she snapped. But Daniel raised a hand slightly. No, he said. Let her finish. That alone shifted the room again. Authority was no longer coming from my parents. The girl looked at me carefully. "But they told you something happened," she continued, "so you stopped trying." A pause, then she added, "My mom said you never stopped caring." That sentence didn't accuse me. It complicated everything instead, because it introduced contradiction where they had presented certainty. My mother exhaled sharply. "This is being staged," she said. "This child is repeating things she doesn't understand." But someone from the guests responded immediately. "Or she's repeating what she was told." That exchange changed the atmosphere completely, because now both sides were being evaluated equally. Daniel looked at my mother. "Who is her mother?" he asked again, this time slower, more deliberate. My mother hesitated again, longer, and that hesitation became an answer. My father finally spoke, but his tone had lost its earlier control. "This doesn't involve you." Daniel shook his head once. "It involves Alina," he said, "so it involves me." And then he looked at me directly. For the first time all night, his voice softened. "Do you recognize any of this?" The question wasn't about guilt. It was about continuity, and I realized I didn't have a clean answer, not because I was hiding something, but because my memory didn't line up with the structure in front of me. A guest stood up halfway again. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, "but this feels like someone has been controlling what she knows for a long time." My mother turned sharply. "That is an outrageous assumption." But it wasn't landing anymore, not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer the simplest explanation in the room. Daniel looked at the documents again, then said quietly, "These aren't accusations, these are records." That distinction ended the argument again, because records don't argue back, they just exist. My father's voice lowered. "You're making conclusions from incomplete context." Daniel nodded slightly. "I agree." Pause, then, "Which is why I'm asking you to complete it." Silence. Something inside me stopped reacting, not emotionally shutting down, but stepping back, observing, because I realized something important. Every version of this story required me to defend myself against something I hadn't fully been shown. So instead of defending, I asked, "What exactly are you saying I did?" The room went quiet again. My mother looked at me sharply. "Alina, don't," but I continued. "No," I said calmly. "If I'm the center of this story, then I should hear it clearly." That was the first time all night I didn't sound defensive, just present. Daniel looked at me longer this time, and I saw it. He was no longer trying to decide what was true. He was trying to decide what had been done to me. My mother's composure finally slipped into something sharper. "This is not the time or place," she said again. But it was weaker now, repetitive. My father added quickly, "We will discuss this privately." But that word, privately, no longer carried authority. It carried avoidance. Daniel responded immediately. "No," he said. "Not anymore." And that was the break, because it meant control of timing was gone. The girl looked at me again, then said quietly, "My mom said if they deny it here, I should show you the last part." My mother went still, not angry, still. That was the first real crack, because she already knew what was coming. The girl reached into the bag one last time, this time slower, careful, like even she understood the weight of what she was about to reveal. She pulled out a final folded document, but before she handed it to me, she hesitated, looked at my mother, then at Daniel, then said quietly, "My mom said this is where the truth stops being something they can fix." And my mother finally whispered, barely audible, "No, not that one." Daniel held out his hand again, calm, firm, waiting, and I realized something in that moment. Whatever was in that paper wasn't a detail. It was the point where the entire story either collapsed or finally became real. The room didn't move when the girl held up the last document. It felt like even breathing had become optional. My mother's face changed first, not into panic exactly, but into something tighter, contained, like someone locking every internal door at once. "No," she said again, but it wasn't directed at the girl anymore. It was directed at the outcome. Daniel didn't look at her this time. His focus stayed on the paper. "Give it to me," he said quietly. The girl hesitated. Then she handed it over. And that simple exchange, child to stranger, truth moving away from the people who tried to contain it, felt like the first irreversible shift of the night. Daniel unfolded it, and everything in him slowed, not dramatically, just enough to notice. He read the first lines, then stopped. Read them again. My father leaned forward slightly. Daniel, don't interpret that out of context. But Daniel didn't respond. He just kept reading, and the silence that followed wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition forming into certainty. Daniel's voice came out lower now. This is a legal declaration, he said. That sentence alone changed the atmosphere. Not emotional, structural. My mother stepped forward quickly. That was never finalized. Too fast, too precise. Daniel looked up. It says it was signed. Silence. My father's jaw tightened. That was administrative, he said quickly. Nothing actionable came from it. But now the words were slipping, because nothing actionable is not the same as nothing happened. Daniel turned the paper slightly toward me. Alina, he said quietly, this references you directly. My stomach tightened, but not from fear, from disorientation, because the document wasn't describing something random. It was describing a decision made about me, not by me. I stared at the page. My internal thought didn't feel emotional anymore. It felt investigative. Why is my name here in a legal structure I don't remember consenting to? Another followed immediately. Why does my family speak about it like it was resolved? That second thought was heavier, because it implied shared knowledge. My mother spoke carefully now. Alina, this doesn't mean what you think it means. But the problem was no longer interpretation. It was presence. The document existed, and I had never seen it. Daniel looked at her. Then explain it, he said. No aggression, just demand for clarity. That was worse. Because calm questioning exposes what anger sometimes hides. A guest spoke again, this time more firmly. If she didn't know about this, then why is she being mentioned in legal documents at all? My father turned sharply. This is not for public discussion. But it already was. That was the point. Daniel didn't even acknowledge him anymore. He looked at my mother. Did you sign this on her behalf? The question landed clean. No room for interpretation. My mother hesitated. And that hesitation again, too long, too visible, fractured her credibility in real time. That was to protect her, she said finally. But the sentence sounded exhausted now. Recycled. And people notice repetition when truth starts running out. The girl spoke softly again. My mom said you stopped trying to find out because they told you it would hurt people if you did. Silence. That sentence didn't accuse anyone directly, but it rebuilt the timeline differently, not abandonment. Interruption, not disappearance. Redirection. Daniel looked at me again, and this time his voice softened fully. Alina, did they ever tell you not to ask questions about your past? That question hit differently, because it wasn't about guilt. It was about restriction. And I realized something slowly. I didn't remember being told yes or no. I remembered being discouraged from asking at all. My answer came quieter than I expected. Yes. The room shifted again, because that was the first clear admission that didn't come from them. My mother exhaled slowly. Alina, we were trying to stabilize things, she said. But the word stabilize didn't match what was in front of us anymore. Daniel looked at her directly. You didn't stabilize anything, he said. You controlled information. My father stood again, but slower now. This is being misrepresented. But even he sounded tired, because defense requires momentum, and they were losing it. Daniel turned to me again. And for the first time all night, his voice didn't sound uncertain. It sounded decided. You weren't given full access to your own history. That sentence didn't accuse me. It separated me from what had been done. And that separation mattered, because it redefined responsibility. People weren't looking at me the same anymore. I could feel it. Not pity, recalculation. A guest whispered. So she might not have even known, another responded. Then what did they tell her all these years? My mother heard it, and something in her composure finally cracked into something more human. Exhaustion, not defense. Daniel finally spoke again. Why would you need to control what she knows? He asked them. That question hung longer than anything else, because it couldn't be answered without revealing intent. And intent is harder to hide than action. My father looked at Daniel directly. This is not something you understand fully, he said. Daniel nodded slightly. I agree. Pause, then, which is why I'm asking you to explain it. Silence. And in that silence, I saw it, for the first time clearly, not accusation, not confusion, but avoidance of full explanation. Not because they couldn't, because they wouldn't. My mother looked at me again, and her voice softened slightly. Alina, we did what we thought was necessary. That sentence should have sounded protective. But it didn't. It sounded final. Daniel held the final document tighter now, then looked at me, not my parents, just me, and said quietly, "This isn't about what they told you anymore." Pause, then. "It's about what they prevented you from ever finding out." My mother whispered, almost to herself, "No, this wasn't supposed to come out like this." And the girl, still standing near the door, added softly, "My mom said, once you see this part, you can't go back to the version they built." Daniel unfolded the last page fully, and as his eyes moved across it, his expression changed one final time. Not doubt, not confusion, but realization. And he said the name again, the one that tied everything together. And this time, my parents didn't correct him. They didn't interrupt. They didn't control the narrative. They just went still. Because now, there was nothing left to contain. When Daniel said the name this time, it didn't echo the way it had before. It settled, like it already belonged in the room. My mother didn't correct him. That was the first real silence that felt like surrender instead of strategy. My father looked down at the table, not at the guests, not at me, at nothing. Daniel held the final page in both hands now, reading it more slowly, not because he didn't understand it, but because he was making sure everyone else did. Then he spoke. "This confirms it." No emotion, just conclusion. My mother exhaled sharply, like she had been holding her breath for years instead of hours. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said quietly. That sentence landed differently than anything else, because it didn't deny truth. It admitted control. A guest at the far table leaned forward. "So she was kept from this information?" she asked. My mother didn't answer. Another voice followed. "And they let her believe something else entirely?" Still no answer. Because now answering would define intent, and intent was no longer defensible. Daniel finally lowered the page. "Alina," he said gently, "this document describes an arrangement where decisions about your past were managed by them." The word managed hung there. Not illegal, not emotional, administrative, controlled. That was the humiliation shift, not exposure of wrongdoing, but exposure of structure. Something inside me stopped resisting, not emotionally collapsing, just clarifying. My internal thought came steady. They didn't just lie once. They curated my entire understanding of a period of my life. Another followed, and everyone else was given a different version. That realization didn't feel like anger. It felt like distance forming, like stepping out of a room I had been breathing inside too long. I looked at my mother, and for the first time I didn't ask why. I asked something simpler. Was I ever told the full truth? My voice wasn't shaking. That surprised even me. My mother tried one last time. "Alina, this was to protect stability in your life." But Daniel responded immediately. "Stability built on withheld truth isn't stability," he said. That sentence landed cleanly in the room. No one argued it, because it didn't require interpretation. My father finally spoke again, but his voice was lower now. "We made decisions as parents," Daniel nodded, "and now you're being evaluated as those decisions are revealed." That shift, evaluated, changed everything again, because it removed authority and replaced it with accountability. The girl stepped slightly closer to me again. "My mom said you were never supposed to be the one blamed," she said quietly. That sentence made my mother close her eyes briefly, not in denial, in recognition of inevitability. Daniel turned slightly toward the girl. "Who is your mother to all of this?" he asked. The girl hesitated, then answered. And when she said the name, my mother finally sat down, slowly, like her body had decided it couldn't support the narrative anymore. That was the first visible collapse, not emotional, structural. People were no longer looking at me as the center of accusation. They were looking at my parents as the source of information control. That reversal was quiet, but irreversible. A guest said softly, "So she might have been misinformed her entire adult life," another added, "and believed it was her own memory." Daniel looked at me again, not with doubt now, with confirmation processing into concern. "Alina," he said, "they didn't just hide information. They shaped what you were allowed to question." That distinction mattered, because it removed responsibility from confusion and placed it on design. My father finally tried to stand again, but slower now, less authority in the movement. "This conversation is over," he said, but it didn't carry weight anymore, because no one agreed with him. Daniel responded calmly. "No," he said, "it just stopped being controlled." That line hit harder than anything else so far, because it marked the exact moment authority ended. My mother looked at me again, and her voice softened into something almost tired. "We didn't want you to carry unnecessary pain." That should have sounded protective, but after everything revealed, it sounded selective. Something in me settled, not forgiveness, not anger, clarity. I looked at them and asked, "What exactly did you decide I should never know?" Silence. This time it wasn't strategic. It was final. Daniel didn't interrupt. Neither did anyone else, because this was the first question that couldn't be redirected. My mother looked at me, and for the first time all night, she didn't have a prepared sentence. Just truth held too long without being spoken. Daniel slowly folded the document, then placed it on the table, not dramatically, just deliberately. "This is no longer hidden information," he said. "It's documented history that was withheld." My father finally spoke, but weaker now. "You're making this sound worse than it is." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm making it accurate." That distinction ended the debate completely, because accuracy cannot be argued with tone, only with counter-evidence, and they had none left. Daniel looked at me one last time and said quietly, "You need to decide something now." Pause, not emotional pressure, structural shift. Because once this is acknowledged publicly, there's no returning to the version they controlled. My mother whispered, barely audible, "This wasn't supposed to go this far." And the girl, still standing near the door, added softly, "My mom said the truth doesn't go back into hiding once it's been spoken twice." Daniel's hand rested on the document, waiting, not for reaction, for direction. And for the first time all night, the power to define what happens next was no longer in my parents' hands. The silence after Daniel spoke wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. For me. That was the first time I noticed the shift clearly, not in what was being said, but in who the room was looking at to define what happens next. My mother realized it too. Her eyes moved toward me, carefully now, like she was trying to re-enter a conversation she no longer controlled. "Alina," she said softly, almost careful, "this doesn't need to escalate further." That word, escalate, felt outdated in the room. Because escalation implies control still exists. I looked at her, not as a daughter trying to understand, but as someone finally seeing the structure behind the years. "I'm not escalating anything," I said quietly. Pause. "I'm just hearing it now." That landed differently, because it reframed everything as delayed truth, not conflict. A guest spoke again, more firmly now. "So she really didn't know any of this?" No one from my parents answered. That silence mattered more than denial. Another voice followed. "Then why was her entire story shaped around something she wasn't aware of?" Daniel didn't speak immediately. He just looked at them, and then said, "Because someone controlled what she was allowed to question." That sentence hit the room cleanly. Not emotional, structural. My father finally exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You're turning this into something it isn't." But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Something inside me started reorganizing, not breaking, rebuilding. My internal thought surfaced clearly. If my memory has gaps, then the gaps were created by omission, not absence. Another followed, which means my confusion was manufactured, not natural. That realization didn't hurt like I expected. It stabilized something, like stepping onto solid ground after realizing the floor had been uneven for years. Daniel watched me closely now, not as someone judging my reaction, but as someone tracking whether I was still trapped in their version of me. The girl stepped forward again, quieter now. "My mom said they didn't want you to connect the pieces too early," she said. My mother's expression tightened instantly. "That's enough," she said, but without force. It sounded like habit now, not authority. Daniel turned to the girl, And why would they care about timing? The girl hesitated, then said, because once she understood it fully, she wouldn't accept what they told her anymore. Silence. That sentence reframed everything again. Not deception as accident, but delay as strategy. Daniel looked at the documents again, then spoke slowly. This wasn't confusion, he said. This was staged understanding over time. My father shook his head. You're interpreting this like a conspiracy. Daniel didn't react. Then explain why every document points to coordinated narrative control. No answer. Because that wasn't interpretive anymore. It was visible. My mother finally spoke again, quieter. We were trying to protect her stability. But even she sounded uncertain now. Like she was repeating something that no longer fit the room it was being said in. A guest stood again. I don't think this is about protection anymore, she said carefully. This looks like selective truth-sharing. That phrase landed heavily. Selective truth-sharing. Not lying, not misunderstanding. Selection. My father finally looked at the room again. This is being distorted into something worse than it is. But no one echoed him. Because the structure of evidence was already too consistent, Daniel turned slightly toward him. No, he said. It's being understood correctly for the first time. I took a slow breath. And for the first time all night, I spoke without looking for validation. I want the full record, I said. Pause, not emotional, not reactive, decisive. My mother blinked. Elena, but I continued. Everything, not summaries, not explanations, the full documentation of what was decided about me. Silence. That request changed the room again because it wasn't emotional anymore. It was procedural, and procedural requests expose everything. My father finally spoke. You don't understand what you're asking for, Daniel answered before I could. She's asking for access to her own history. That sentence ended the argument, because denying it now would mean admitting control. My mother's voice softened again, almost breaking. This will hurt you. But this time, it didn't sound like protection. It sounded like warning from someone who had been holding something too long. Daniel gathered the documents together slowly, then looked at me. This is where it changes, he said quietly, not dramatic, finalizing. My mother whispered, this wasn't supposed to reach this point. And the girl added softly, my mom said once she sees everything, she decides for herself. Daniel slid the final papers forward slightly, waiting, not for reaction, for acceptance of truth. And in that moment, the rehearsal dinner stopped being about accusation. It stopped being about confusion. It became something else entirely. The moment where the truth was no longer hidden, but fully about to be faced. Folder hit the table with a sound that wasn't loud, but it carried. Not impact. Finality. Daniel didn't slide it toward me immediately. He just kept his hand on it. Like he was making sure I understood this wasn't another fragment anymore. This was everything. My mother spoke first, quickly. Elena, please don't open that here. That was the mistake. Because don't open it here implies it's still containable elsewhere, and nothing about tonight was containable anymore. I looked at her, and said calmly, then where was I supposed to open it? Silence. No answer. A guest leaned forward again. So they've had this entire record, and she hasn't seen any of it. Another responded quietly. That means her version of her own life was filtered. Filtered. That word spread. My father finally spoke, but his voice had lost structure. This was not meant to be withheld permanently. Daniel looked up. But it was withheld long enough to shape her decisions. That line landed heavier than anything else, because it defined consequence, not intention. Something shifted inside me again, not confusion, separation. My internal thought formed clearly, I am not inside the story anymore. I'm reading it. Another followed, and I wasn't given all the pages. That realization didn't feel emotional. It felt like stepping outside a building you've been inside your whole life and realizing you never saw its full structure. Daniel opened the folder slowly and began reading aloud. This outlines, he said, scanning, a coordinated decision to manage information about Elena's early adult history due to reputational concerns within the family structure. My mother closed her eyes briefly. Not denial. Acknowledgement. Daniel continued. It states that direct disclosure to Alina was delayed until stability conditions were met. A guest immediately reacted. Stability conditions, another replied. That sounds like they decided when she was allowed to know her own life. The room shifted again. My father spoke sharply. You're reading it too literally. But Daniel didn't even look at him. I'm reading it exactly as it's written. That sentence ended his defense. The girl stepped closer one more time. My mom said if they opened that folder, the missing part would explain everything. My mother stiffened again. No, she said quietly, that's not for this moment. But Daniel already found it. A separate sealed addendum. Older, stamped. He looked at it for a long moment, then said the name again, the name that had been circling all night. And this time my mother didn't react. She just sat still. That was the final collapse of control. Daniel read the addendum, then paused. This confirms involvement of a third party in managing information flow, he said. My father finally spoke again, but weak. That was handled legally at the time. Daniel nodded slightly, but not transparently. Silence, because transparency was the only thing missing from every explanation they gave. My mother finally looked at me, and her voice came quieter than before. We were trying to prevent you from being hurt by it. But now even that didn't land, because I finally understood something. Hurt wasn't what they avoided. Control was what they maintained. A guest stood again. So she was never given a choice about what she believed about her own past. Another responded, and everyone around her was given a different version. Daniel closed the folder slightly, then looked at my parents. This isn't interpretation anymore, he said. It's documented control of information. That sentence ended resistance completely, because documentation removes argument. It only leaves consequence. My father sat down slowly. For the first time, I felt rage, but also I felt clarity. I looked at my parents and asked quietly, why didn't you ever think I should decide for myself? Silence. My mother's lips parted slightly, but no answer came, because there wasn't a version of that question they could safely respond to. Daniel looked at me, and for the first time all night, his voice softened completely. Because they already decided for you, he said. That sentence wasn't accusation, it was explanation, and it landed like closure beginning to form. Daniel closed the folder fully, then said quietly, this is now known. Not dramatic, not emotional, final, my mother whispered. This wasn't supposed to leave the family. And the girl added softly, my mom said once it leaves the family, it stops being controllable. Daniel looked at me, waiting, not for reaction, for what I choose to do with truth now fully visible. And in that moment, the rehearsal dinner stopped being an accusation and became the point where truth finally stopped being managed. No one spoke after Daniel closed the folder, not because they were confused, because there was nothing left to reinterpret. My mother finally looked around the room like she was seeing it for the first time tonight, not as control, but as exposure. That shift in her expression was subtle, but irreversible. My father stayed seated now, hands folded tightly in front of him like he was trying to contain something that had already spilled. Daniel didn't move either. He just looked at me, waiting, not pushing, not directing, just waiting to see what I would do with truth that was no longer filtered through anyone else. And for the first time, I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about what I chose to accept as real. A guest finally broke the silence. So, what does this mean for her? She asked quietly. No one from my parents answered, because answering would require claiming authority over something they no longer controlled. Another voice followed. She's been living under a version of her life that wasn't complete. That sentence landed heavily. Incomplete, not false, not fabricated, incomplete, and that distinction changed everything in the room. Daniel looked at my parents. Do you understand what you did? He asked calmly. My mother exhaled slowly. We protected her from consequences we thought she wasn't ready for. But even she didn't sound convinced anymore, because protection doesn't usually require secrecy at this scale. My internal thought formed clearly. They didn't just shape my past. They delayed my access to it. Another followed, and I lived as if what I knew was everything there was. That realization didn't feel like shock. It felt like distance growing between me and the version of life I used to defend. Daniel spoke quietly. "Alina, this isn't about what they told you anymore." Pause. "It's about what you now choose to believe about yourself." That sentence landed differently than everything else, because it returned agency, not emotion, agency. The girl stepped forward one more time. Her voice was softer now, almost careful. "My mom said they didn't want you to find out in pieces," she said, "but they couldn't stop it once it started." My mother closed her eyes again briefly, not denial, acceptance fatigue. Daniel looked at her. "You didn't lose control tonight," he said quietly. "You lost it a long time ago. Tonight just revealed it." That sentence landed like a final judgment, but without hostility, just observation. And that made it heavier. My father finally spoke again, but his voice had changed. Lower, stripped of confidence. "This doesn't have to go beyond this room." Daniel shook his head once. "It already has. Because truth doesn't stay contained once it's witnessed collectively." My mother looked at me again. And this time, there was no strategy in her expression, just something closer to exhaustion. "We didn't know how to tell you," she said softly. That was the first sentence all night that didn't feel defensive. But it also wasn't enough anymore. I finally spoke again. Calm, clear. "I'm not asking how you told me," I said. Pause. "I'm asking why I wasn't allowed to see it myself." Silence. That question didn't require emotion. It required justification. And there wasn't a clean one left. Daniel watched me closely now, because this was the moment where reaction turned into direction. And I realized something important. No one else could define what happens next anymore. Not them. Not Daniel. Not the room. A guest stood again. "So the entire accusation from earlier tonight," she said slowly, "was built on incomplete information." No one answered, because answering would confirm the collapse of their narrative. Another voice followed. "And she's the one who was humiliated publicly with that version." That sentence landed clean. My mother's expression tightened slightly, because now the consequence wasn't just exposure. It was remembered exposure. Daniel looked at her. "You didn't just withhold truth," he said quietly. "You weaponized absence." That line ended any remaining defense. Something in me shifted again, but this time it wasn't reconstruction. It was separation. My internal thought formed. This happened to me, but it does not define me unless I allow it to. Another followed. Truth is not ownership. It is information. That distinction mattered more than anything tonight, because it removed emotional captivity from discovery. Daniel spoke again, softer now. "What you do next matters more than what they did." And I understood that immediately. My mother looked at me one last time, not asking for forgiveness, not defending anymore, just watching. My father didn't speak. The room didn't speak. Even Daniel didn't push, because everything had already reached its final structural point. And then the girl said quietly, "My mom said once you know everything, you decide what version of your life continues." Daniel looked at me, the folder still on the table, the truth fully exposed. No more missing pieces, no more controlled versions, just reality, waiting. And for the first time all night, the question wasn't what they did. It was what I would do now that I finally knew. The room didn't move, not because it was frozen, because there was nothing left to perform. The folder sat on the table like it no longer belonged to anyone. Not my parents, not Daniel, not even me, just truth unassigned. My mother looked at me like she was trying to find a version of this moment where she still had influence over how I interpreted it. But that version didn't exist anymore. My father finally spoke, but his voice was lower than before. "Alina, this doesn't change who we are to you." That sentence hung there longer than anything else, because it tried to separate identity from action. But the room wasn't operating on identity anymore. It was operating on what had been done. A guest spoke quietly. "It already changed how she understands her own life." Another responded, "And how everyone here understands what they were told tonight." That was the shift, not accusation, recalibration. Daniel finally moved the folder slightly closer to the center of the table. Not toward me, not toward them, neutral placement. That mattered, because it meant ownership was gone. He looked at my parents. "You controlled what she was allowed to know," he said, "but you don't control what happens with it now." No anger, just consequence. Something in me changed again, but not in a defensive way, in a clarifying way. My internal thought formed, this was never about my worth. It was about information access. Another followed immediately, and access was controlled. That distinction removed something heavy I hadn't realized I was carrying. Daniel watched me carefully now, because he could see the shift too, not emotional collapse, emotional detachment forming into clarity. The girl stepped forward again, but this time she didn't look at my parents. She looked at me. My mom said you were never supposed to be confused about this much of your own life, she said softly. My mother's expression tightened again, but weaker now, like repetition without effect. Daniel nodded slightly. That's the core of it, he said quietly. Pause. You weren't confused by accident. You were guided into partial understanding. That sentence landed differently, because it reframed confusion as outcome, not condition. My father finally exhaled. This is not how we intended it to be understood. Daniel looked at him. And yet this is how it exists. That was the final distinction. Intention versus reality, and reality was now public. My mother spoke again, but her voice had lost direction. We thought we were protecting you from emotional instability. But even she paused after saying it, because it no longer justified scale. It only explained motivation, not outcome. I looked at all of them, not as accusation targets, not as authority figures, just as people who had participated in shaping something I now had to decide how to carry forward. My internal thought formed clearly. I don't need to accept their version of my life to understand my own. Another followed, and I don't need to punish to reclaim clarity. That realization felt grounding, not soft, stable. Daniel spoke quietly. This next part is yours. And I understood what he meant, not the truth, the response to it. A guest finally stood again. So what happens now? She asked. No one answered immediately, because now the answer didn't belong to the parents. It didn't belong to Daniel. It belonged to the outcome. Another voice added, she gets to decide what version of this becomes her life moving forward. That sentence reframed everything again. Not damage, direction. My mother looked at me one last time, and I saw it. Not control anymore, loss of narrative authority. Quiet acceptance that whatever she had tried to contain was no longer containable. The room waited. Daniel didn't speak. The girl didn't move. My parents didn't interrupt. And for the first time all night, there was no one shaping what I was supposed to say next. I looked at the folder, then at the people in the room, then at my parents. And I said quietly, I'm not continuing any version of my life that requires me not to know it fully. Silence. Not shock. Recognition. Because that wasn't revenge, that was reclamation. Daniel exhaled slowly, and my mother closed her eyes, not in denial this time, but in acknowledgement that the story they controlled had finally left their control. For a few seconds after I spoke, nobody reacted. Not because they didn't hear me, because they were recalibrating what I had just said. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was final in a way that didn't invite correction. My mother looked down first, not at the table, at her hands, like she was trying to find something stable to hold onto that wasn't a narrative anymore. My father stayed still, but his posture had changed. Less authority, more containment. Daniel finally broke the silence, not loudly, just clearly. That's your answer. He wasn't asking me to confirm. He was acknowledging the shift. A guest spoke softly. So she's not accepting their version anymore. Another responded. She never really had the full version to begin with. That sentence carried through the room like a reset. Not blame, structure correction. My mother finally spoke, but her voice was quieter now. Elena, we never intended to distort your life. But even she didn't follow it with defense, because intention no longer carried weight here. Outcome did. Daniel looked at her. And yet that's what happened. No anger, just closure of argument. Something inside me settled into place. Not emotionally charged, just clear. My internal thought formed, I don't need agreement to understand what happened. Another followed, I only need accuracy. That shift changed everything, because I stopped looking at them for validation of truth, and started looking at truth itself as independent of them. Daniel noticed. His expression softened slightly, not pity, just recognition of clarity forming. The girl shifted slightly near the doorway again, but this time she didn't speak immediately. She just watched, then said quietly, "My mom said once you understand it fully, you don't belong to the confusion anymore." That sentence hit the room differently, not emotional, directional. My mother closed her eyes again briefly, longer this time, like she was finally letting go of the attempt to control interpretation. A guest finally stood. "I think we all understand this differently now," she said carefully. Another nodded, but not in the way it was presented earlier. That was the key shift. Earlier narrative versus reconstructed understanding. My father finally spoke, but his voice was quieter than ever. "This was never meant to become public interpretation," Daniel responded calmly. "But it did." That ended it, because reality overrides intention once it's shared. I looked at my parents again, not with anger, not with collapse, with final clarity. "I'm not continuing any relationship built on incomplete truth about my own life," I said quietly. Pause. "I don't need to punish anyone to leave it." That sentence landed differently in the room, because it removed drama and replaced it with agency. Daniel exhaled slowly, and for the first time he didn't intervene. He just observed the outcome. My mother finally spoke one last time. "Alina, we thought we were doing the right thing at the time." But her voice didn't carry defense anymore, just reflection, and regret that arrived too late to change structure. My father didn't add anything, because there was nothing left that wouldn't weaken their position further. The guests didn't whisper anymore. They just understood. That was the final stage of social shift, not judgment, recognition. Daniel looked at me, not asking, just present, and said quietly, "What do you want to do now?" That question wasn't about the room. It wasn't about them. It was about continuation. I looked at the folder, then at the people who had shaped my incomplete version of reality. And I said, "I want my life back in full view, not edited, not filtered. Mine." Silence, not resistance, acceptance of finality. And for the first time since this began, the power in the room didn't belong to whoever controlled the story. It belonged to the person who finally stopped needing permission to understand it. The word hung there longer than anything else that night. Mine. Not loud, not emotional, not performative, just final in a way that didn't invite negotiation. The room didn't respond immediately, because there was nothing left to argue against without sounding like control. My mother shifted slightly in her seat, like she was adjusting to a version of me she hadn't planned for. My father finally spoke, but carefully. "Alina, walking away from family over misunderstandings." Daniel interrupted him, calm but firm. "These aren't misunderstandings anymore." That sentence ended the argument before it could begin. A guest quietly gathered her things, then another, not abruptly, not dramatically, just slowly, like people recalibrating what kind of situation they were in. One of them said under her breath, "This isn't a wedding rehearsal anymore." Another responded, "It stopped being that a while ago." That was the quiet humiliation shift for my parents, not public shouting, not confrontation, but withdrawal of shared framing. The room no longer treated them as narrators of the situation. They were participants in it. My internal thought formed, "I don't owe continuation to relationships that required partial truth." Another followed, "And I don't need emotional closure from people who controlled information instead of sharing it." That was the separation point, not from them physically yet, but internally. Daniel watched me carefully, as if confirming I wasn't reacting impulsively. I wasn't. I was deciding. Daniel finally spoke quietly. "What do you want your next step to be with them?" Not pressure, clarity request. My mother looked up slightly at that. That question mattered more than everything else tonight, because it was no longer about what happened. It was about what continues. I looked at her, then at my father, and for the first time I didn't feel pulled in either direction, only distance. "I need distance," I said quietly. Pause. "Not punishment, not confrontation, distance." That sentence landed cleanly. No emotional escalation. No performance, just structure. My mother's expression tightened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. My father exhaled slowly, like he already knew this was coming. Daniel nodded once. Not approving, acknowledging. A guest quietly whispered, "So it's not reconciliation." "God, how could family do that?" Another replied, "It's separation based on truth exposure." She deserves peace. That framing mattered because it removed emotional dramatization and replaced it with consequence logic. My mother finally spoke, softer now. "Elena, we can talk about this after emotions settle." But even she didn't push anymore, because she understood something had already settled permanently. I looked at her and realized something simple. I wasn't waiting for closure anymore. I didn't need the emotional explanation version of events. I needed factual ownership of my own life story. My internal thought formed. Closure is optional, truth is not. That separation clarified everything. Daniel leaned slightly back, giving me space to decide fully without influence. The silence made it obvious what the real question was now. Not what happened, not what was revealed, but what remains connected. My father finally spoke quietly. "You're still our daughter." That sentence used to carry automatic emotional weight. Tonight it didn't, because identity wasn't the issue anymore. Access and truth were. I looked at him and said calmly, "I don't stop being your daughter by stepping away from control I didn't consent to." Pause. "But I also don't stay inside it." That was the answer, not dramatic, final. My mother closed her eyes briefly. This time longer, not denial, acknowledgement, because there was nothing left to defend without contradicting everything already exposed. Daniel spoke quietly. "That's a boundary, not a conflict." And that distinction mattered, because boundaries don't require opposition, only recognition. The room began to thin further as guests left, not because of scandal, because resolution had already formed. As people slowly cleared out, Daniel stayed. The girl was guided away quietly by someone I assumed was with her mother. My parents remained seated. No further argument, no final defense. Just presence in a version of the night they no longer controlled. Daniel finally looked at me. "So this is your line?" he asked softly. I nodded once. "Yes." Pause. "And now I rebuild from here." The room behind me was almost empty, but the decision wasn't. It was already made. Whether I fully cut ties or rebuild with boundaries, one thing was clear. My life no longer continued inside someone else's edited version of it. It continued in truth, on my terms. What happened that night didn't end with shouting or revenge. It ended with clarity. And that's what stayed with me more than anything else. When someone controls your understanding of your own life, what do you owe them once you finally see it clearly? My parents didn't lose me in one moment. They lost the version of control that kept my story incomplete. And that changes everything. So I want to ask you this directly. If you were in my place, would you have walked away completely, cut ties, or tried to rebuild something after everything was exposed? And where do you think the real line is between family mistakes and controlled truth? I'm genuinely curious how different people see this, because I think the answer says a lot more about us than the story itself. Please like and subscribe if you liked the story.